Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our latest episode of Wannabe Wednesdays, coming to you on the 20th of January. And the big news this week, which we'll get to, of course, is that Star Ladder was the big tournament that you guys just watched this past week. So we'll get into that. As usual, I am Korean Barbecue with my co-host Wood Shrew. How's you going? How are you doing, Shrew?
I'm doing good, man. Spent a lot of today binge watching Star Ladder footage, so my head's all filled up with Dota. I'm ready to have a release on this podcast episode.
Perfect. So we're gonna start with some news, kind of roundup from around the scene, and the first is that Axmo, who was playing offlane for Navi for a little bit over a month, is now out of the team, and so there was some drama behind this, and just a lot of maybe things that should not have been said or publicized. What happened, True?
It was kind of strange because we kind of found out about the the issues within the the fit of Axmo and Navi a bit early, because PBD's vlogs that he uploads on YouTube, he mentioned that his scrims results were leaked, hit the drafts during the pre-Star Ladder bootcamp, and that he was very upset about that, obviously, because when you're playing scrims between professional teams, there's a general agreement that you don't share strategies between other teams, right? So that people can select scrimming partners very strategically or whatnot. But with those things being leaked out, PPD was very upset, and that turned out actually being Axmo leaking them to I think some kind of friend who leaked it onto the big Russian pro Dota forums, and that was a really big issue. And he didn't stop there, and he kind of was a little bit active on the kind of Russian Dota social media websites, and from publicly criticizing Artstyle's drafting and his picks, as well as kind of having this back and forth exchange with VLAT on Twitter, and as well on these forums. It was kind of getting messy, and it's not that big of a surprise that Navi ended up letting them go as well.
So there's kind of this underground scrim. I don't want to call it a metagame, but it has its own ecosystem. Sometimes some teams will refuse to play certain other teams, or make sure that they only play certain teams. And then obviously, it's definitely sacred ground in terms of not releasing strategies and leaking stuff. Obviously, we had that the Ritsu incident a couple months ago, and now this is just kind of his own team. So I think, it seems that he broke some very unspoken but very clearly defined rules, I guess, and just getting into it with people, and he's that's the end of his run with Navi, I guess.
And potentially, maybe even with other well-established pros, because if the pro Dota Illuminati have cast him as an outsider, then he's gonna be on the outside looking in if he's looking for another roster to play on. So kind of like how Ritsu's in right now. So
well, I mean that makes sense. I guess it's pretty much a fairly golden rule, it seems. So some other changes. Team Empire seemed to be undergoing a major role change. It looks like Funnick is moving to support away from the offlane. Havost is going to take his spot in that offlane, even though we have known and basically grown up with Havost as a carry player, and Aloha Dance is going to be reprising that role. So what do you make of these changes?
I don't know. It's kind of confusing and a little bit unexpected, I guess. But I do kind of know that the kind of rumblings from the CIS scrims and even some internal people who I'm privy to know in Team Empire's organization, they kind of forecasted this role swap a couple weeks back, maybe even a month or so back. So it was kind of in the works, I suppose. Maybe the team has been testing it out in scrims as well. But I'm not sure how Havost is going to be the tower dive against a tri-lane, or Funnick's going to do support jungle darks here, but I guess we'll see, right?
You know what? Because you just said that, that just evoked this image of him being an ROTK type thing, where he just does
right?
This, super super aggressive or seemingly random things, and just and he maybe develops a reputation because that aggression actually. I mean, maybe you could start to see it in some recent matches, but sometimes he would seem to it would work against him maybe a little bit more than in the past. Like I remember a game from I think it was the I think it was the open qualifiers where like he wasn't even diving a tower, but like he didn't take aggro off the tower when he went to try to kill someone. He
I
just
think I
like
saw
died
that.
to tower fire.
Yeah, I think I saw that. I was like, oh, boast. Oh man.
Yeah, he is like the embodiment of like aggression coming out from that position. So it'll be interesting to see how that works because I mean some offlaners maybe that kind of helps you where they're less about picking their spots necessarily, but more about just like, okay, I'm gonna be up in your face and if you kill me, that's fine, but you're gonna have to spend time and keep heroes around to kill me. So I don't know, like I don't see Havos just suddenly shifting and becoming like this super conservative, like pick your spots, precise offlaner, and that's it's gonna be entertaining if he keeps up that aggressive style.
Yeah, that's a good point that you made. Like, I don't see how Hovost can kind of play that like universe style, like super patient and careful laning off lane. I could see him definitely being that kind of Darkseer who dies for his level two like twice or something like that. Plays very instinctively, and I mean, like the most characteristic or like signature clip I have in mind when you mentioned the like Navi Hovost is him playing Alchemist at like what TI3 and like doing all those tree jukes, and if he's able to pull that kind of stuff off in the offlane, then it's gonna be really exciting to follow Team Empire.
Yeah, and we might not see Havos with the rapier again for a really long time.
Right,
That
right.
hurts me.
End of an era, right?
So some other news coming out of the scene, fairly recent, is that Evil Geniuses apparently, according to Twitter, I think PPD saying that they will not be taking part in ESL Manila, which is at the end of April, and which basically takes place about a month or so before the newly announced Manila major. So
Yeah.
I don't think this is really a big surprise because I don't know if it was PPD or Charlie a few months ago on Twitter saying that they didn't really see too like they basically forecasted this. They said,
Yeah.
like it doesn't really make sense to fly all the way across the world to go play in a single elimination tournament that lasts like 2 days. Like it's probably not worth it. And we talked about this kind of before with WCA and like EG maybe being in a position where they can pick their spots a bit more than some other teams. But yeah, so this is the culmination of that in some ways.
Yeah, I think if there's any team in the scene that is going to be highly selective about, choosing tournaments and not being kind of tempted by prize pools or other teams that are flying and competing there, it's going to be EG, right? And yeah, I do recall that they were already kind of had their own doubts about going to Manila because it's not really timed too well, right? They don't really want to have such a disruption in their schedule as well as like just these players' lifestyles. They can't constantly be jet lagged, and it does cost these guys quite some energy and time away from scrims and practice and their own personal lives, which is a big factor.
Yeah, there's also a certain volatility depending on the format. Like if it's anything like some of the other ESL events, as we mentioned, it's single elimination. I mean, they could get all the way across the world, play two bad games, and they're
Yeah,
done. And that's not probably not this kind of setting they want to be in. But
yeah,
there should
yeah.
still be a good field for that tournament.
I feel like if you mention single limb, it's just like the trigger word for PPD. He's like, "Oh, single limb? All right, no, that's just not happening." Like,
But yeah, they
no,
do excel
completely
at just
triggered.
figuring things out and just tinkering on the fly and
Hmm.
adapting to stuff. And with single limb, that could hurt them. So yeah, it does make sense for them. But we talk about the majors, and of course, there's the announcement of the Manila major, and that's one of the good things about this is that even if you, not only is it more opportunities for other teams, but then you do have more of a guarantee of these kind of longer term, bigger events that you'll be guaranteed to see these big teams at. And yeah, I mean anything that creates more opportunities and like proliferates Dota is a good thing. So once again, EG, someone will be happy to fill their shoes if they can't make it for that tournament.
Yeah, for sure.
So the big fish that we were going to fry today is, of course, Star Ladder. So this was, by all accounts, a very well produced event and very exciting event. PPD saying on his vlog basically quote that it was like a professional event and it was crazy and he felt like a superstar perhaps for the first
Hmm.
time at an event like this. So what can you say about this about how this event felt to you and maybe just the presentation and all that?
Yeah, just like when I started to, follow along with a couple of the group stage games, um, there wasn't. I think most of the group stage games were not played in the actual venue, right? And so the actual Starladder LAN event really kicked off with the first round of playoffs, I suppose. But as soon as that began, I think the Twitter sphere was like very like a buzz of like how special the crowd was at this at Minsk Arena, and like throughout the weekend when it started to fill up more and more, like the commentators and the desk kept commenting on how many people were there and how vigorous the support was for different teams, that there was like a very large Swedish following, that seems that Alliance kind of brought along with them or something like that, because with every Alliance game, like the Swedish support was just so loud, and the cheering was really, really intense, and that brings a lot of a special atmosphere, I feel like, to even viewers who are just on Twitch, because you just get much more of a sense of importance and significance to the event, and that's really important because there's a lot of tournaments now that are well, there was a period of time where there were a lot of online tournaments which didn't have this LAN aspect, like the physical LAN aspect, and it feels a lot more sterile, and it just feels like you're just watching another online qualifier, even though there's grand final in the title. And Starladder just brought a very complete package, I felt, in terms of production, presentation, and most importantly, like the fan atmosphere.
I love the enthusiasm I've seen from these European land events. I mean, I think like they've had a more developed kind of culture and more accepting culture of that for a while, but there's
Yeah.
like a noticeable difference. Like like ESL New York, for example, there's a big crowd there, but it's relatively subdued. But then at the Frankfurt Major, like you had these people. It was I couldn't believe I was there for Dota. Like it could have been any event because you had these people. The guy with like the bananas, some guy with like war paint, like these like OG war painted dudes, just like
Oh
rallying the
yeah, yeah.
crowd and stuff. It
Do you
was
remember
like
the karaoke guys, like with like karaoke written on their chest or something? They're like shirtless. I don't know if you remember that, but
yeah, it was like a Scandinavian invasion almost, right? I love that. That was great. And then
yeah.
for Starladder, well, I mean, you get this kind of atmosphere like TI and stuff too, where it's like where like the casters are talking about the game, and then you just hear like the crowd roaring in the back. It's nice.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
really adds so much excitement to like not needing just the casters to kind of like milk it. It's just all there, and you can feel the energy. So that's really cool. And then of course one of the real hotbeds in terms of fandom for Dota, CIS, and then Southeast Asia as well. So I heard a rumor before the Manila announcement, probably a couple of weeks ago, that Kiev was going to be the site of the next major, and apparently that's not going to be the case. But I would not be surprised if CIS gets one really soon, and I'm glad on that note that Southeast Asia is getting one because also like rabid interest in Dota down there as well.
yeah. I mean, it's definitely rivals this yes, scene. But yeah. I mean, there was no polar bears on stage, unfortunately, as there was with past star ladders or whatnot. But yeah, production value. Just you bring up that word, TI. I was definitely getting some sense of, evoking some feelings of past internationals because, the casters all suited up and the desk was run really well. And there was like that Russian stage presenter who was like very suave and like briskly walking out and presenting very well and stuff. It was really, really good. Really cool.
Yeah, and I'm glad to have seen Slacks out there because Slacks,
Yeah.
he usually kind of does these like maybe more laid back interviews, and he still brings that air of like that kind of air with him. But it was nice to see him like out there in a bigger role, carrying on that for Starladder.
hmm He definitely always
So
brings a lot of enthusiasm. Yeah.
so, well, shifting to the Dota itself, it's taken us a while to get to it. Um, we talked about I don't want to say it because we've heard it so much about Alliance being back and such. They maybe we could have said it after WCA already, but they of course ended up taking this event, beating EG 2-0 in the grand finals, and we did say last week, I guess again it's nice to be kind of proven wrong. We said that hey, maybe if they were in the open qualifiers, if they weren't invited, then who knows if they would come out of that. And I'm not going
hmm
to take back saying that. It's not a knock on them. It's just because of how loaded the field is, and how like how volatile this Dota can still be when you don't get that large of a sample size in that many games. But they had a pretty impressive showing, and we talked about steadily. It's like they bring back these kind of classic heroes and start buffing them like Puck, Nature's Prophet, Lone Druid, even Chen and such. And Alliance has been they've played a lot of games on this patch like beginning with WC8, and they've really ridden that momentum. They seem to understand it pretty well, and they ended up taking Starletter.
Yeah. I mean, I think your point still stands, and I think like, our shared observation that Alliance's invitation to the major, like if they had progressed through the qualifiers, there isn't too much of a guarantee. Um, because even though they did end up pulling out a star ladder, like the eventual champions, and if you kind of take a quick glance over like the series scores, you just see, oh wow, Alliance, 2-0 DG in the grand finals, 2-0 Team Liquid, 2-1 Team Secret. That seems like a very dominant performance, right? But a lot of those games were still very contested. For every contested game, there was kind of a Alliance, full steamroll performance. But a lot of those series were very, very close. Especially, I would say, the Team Secret Alliance one, which was actually the first playoff series that they played. I wasn't able to watch the full game, full game front to back, but I do remember that Team Secret picked up the first game, and in the second game, they were in a very good position to close out Alliance like straight 2-0, and we would have a very different storyline right now on our hands if Team Secret were the eventual victors of that series. But Alliance did end up bouncing back, and they kind of pulled off their own, impersonation of EG, just kind of rolling straight through the lower bracket and pulling out.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. They were on the brink of elimination, and again, it's just
Hmm.
a totally different narrative. And then maybe the shouts of, "Oh, maybe they should have been invited or something just get louder and louder." But
Right.
again, like so much turns on, and a lot of these games are so close and relatively volatile. But they did put things together. This patch has definitely favored them in a lot of ways. Like you see, like the return of kind of the playmaking mid. Something like even like a Night Stalker, Bat and Puck, especially multiple teams ran that, and those are just those are just S4 specialties. It feels like that you don't really want him sitting there, maybe with the farmer as much as you want him having someone who can make kills and create tempo for your team. So that was nice for him. And then the other heroes that have been buffed. I mean, we talked about this, but Nahaz, who we hope to have on the show really soon, was talking about how Chen in this patch is like by far the most successful hero by comparison to other patches, and like obviously the huge jungle buffs have definitely helped. And this hero, I mean, this hero in terms of tempo, in terms of pressure, in terms of taking objectives, like he's pretty much unmatched right now, and maybe the strongest that he's ever been, except maybe for like the early TIs and stuff where there wasn't much answer and you almost had to have a jungler at sometimes. He's
Hmm.
quite strong right now, and these are all comfort heroes. Lone Druid, we talked about getting the buffs as well and getting put into captain's mode. I mean, that was already a signature hero, obviously for Bulldog, but that's a hero that we've seen a ton from like every team almost picking and banning it. That's become a premium hero in 6.86 in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, like when we start up on the list of Alliance's signature heroes and the tools that they relied on to really dominate this tournament. At the end of the day, these heroes have received sort of like continuous buffs for a long time, and I feel like that's sort of the life cycle of these heroes, and from patch to patch and changelog to changelog. It's like, well, these Chen and Batrider and Bear, one time or another were first ban material many patches ago, right? Many TIs ago, as it starts to feel like. But they get nerfed into oblivion, right? Because Ice Frog gets really sick of seeing first ban Chen or first ban Bat, and they kind of continuously slowly build up, a little bit buffs here and there, and after a couple patches, they're right back into the fold. And Chen has been kind of reworked in a very fundamental way in terms of his eggs being able to take over ancient creeps like many patches ago. You have Bear now who has like a roar, Prophet who has a very different eggs and even kind of a different play style now than in the past in terms of builds and skill. And even Batrider, like he's come full circle as well. For a long time he was kind of just not usable and considered a very very broken hero in terms of like just you just can't pick it, you can't win with it, and now he's come all the way back up to being the a very powerhouse hero for a lot of teams even, and but especially for S4.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's definitely that like cyclical nature because I do remember you phrased it perfectly where like Batrider was literally the obligatory first pick or ban like every single game because that hero you could send to the off lane. He had so much damage coming out, and it was like a nightmare to zone. If you had the wrong heroes, you couldn't even think about zoning him. You'd have to worry about him killing you or sometimes grabbing multiple
Mm.
kills. If you did manage to force him out, he would just very easily get into the jungle and then I still remember like, like Universe getting forced to the jungle and then coming out with like what, like a 7.5 minute or 6.5 minute blink
Yeah,
or
yeah,
something like
yeah.
that. Yeah, and that hero just did so much, and now you're seeing it in a bit of a different role. But I think the playmaking mid, and we'll talk about like Invoker and stuff as well, who can kind of control tempo. I think that's been very fun to watch. Like from like a spectator standpoint, it's more interesting to watch that kind of thing. Even though you do have kind of stalled and stalemated games sometimes, like
Mhm.
if a team feels that they want to take objectives and push, but they can't do that safely, that happens sometimes too. But generally speaking, I think this meta has been a lot more action packed, and I think seeing this tournament and seeing like games, like length of game is not necessarily an indicator of it being watchable or fun or anything like that. But you see a lot of different things, and you see a lot of favoring like kind of fights, but like objectives. But there's like a tension around taking them versus like in the past where sometimes it'd be too obvious if one team is able to death ball and the other doesn't have the tools to fight back or anything like that. So it's been nice, and it's been nice seeing all these heroes just kind of get worked in, and the newer heroes with a lot of variability to them. We talk about like Earth Spirit and even Oracle and stuff like that, who hasn't been doing that well. So it's nice to it's really just a fresh injection of blood to the game, it seems, and that's kind of what we suspected and said after the qualifiers, and I think Starladder confirmed that some more.
Yeah, I really think that it is kind of fascinating to think about like the watchability of this sort of push-oriented meta in comparison to other push-oriented or death ball metas in the past because TI4 was considered a very like difficult to watch and unwatchable TI and tournament in general just because it was sort of predictable, but for some reason Alliance just always brings so much excitement into the way they play. Maybe it's just the way S4 is just such a, dazzling mid player when he really gets the momentum behind him, or just the drama behind the way Alliance, kind of has that continuous relationship between pushing and also split pushing, and always kind of leveraging those two, opposing forces to their best, to their best strengths. But I mean, there's so many things that have changed in terms of the meta that you've even just like passively mentioned that we could talk for at length on. But I do want to bring up the idea that you did talk about, which is that, and something that the casters and the desk mentioned a lot, is that the mid lane has become more of a playmaking stage, right? And for heroes like Batrider and Puck and Invoker, like you said, and that's a far cry from the days of watching. Shadow Fiends, for example, just kind of push out waves and then retreat to the jungle and play a very passive style, farm-oriented, approach. And we've kind of come from this another cycle that's kind of mirroring this, these, the progression of a hero between patches is that like, mid lane has started, a few patches ago was very like farm focused. You kind of ran your carry mid lane, so to speak, and then it kind of moved towards like a utility, but also some kind of middle ground between a playmaker but also a farmer. Heroes like Lina and Ember Spirit come to mind. Even Shadow Fiends in terms of some utility builds with like Yules and Blink. And then now we've come right back to, many patches ago and styles ago where, it's finally back to like some Puck and Quap facing off mid, and it's really cool to see.
Yeah, certainly. And we have seen also heroes that well, you still see them sporadically depending on which team, but like hero like Zeus, for example, saw a lot of play this tournament. I think he was run something like 13 times,
Mhm.
although not with the greatest win rate. And then you're seeing heroes that remain popular, and I don't know, it's just such a mishmash of styles. And we talked about this, like we talked about will the teams coming into this tournament like bring their styles with them, and because we saw so much diversity throughout the course of the Shanghai Open and main qualifiers. So that did happen. Like it did feel like the teams kind of did bring their own technique. Like LGD has had they definitely love that Morphling, who Siler has been piloting for a long time, since like the TI2 heyday, and he played that hero. Obviously like he felt very comfortable with it, and they used that, and they drafted a lot of like somewhat team fight and AOE heavy lineups. And then you had teams that went back to their strengths. Then you had teams that were like EG as usual, just kind of being able to run anything. And you had teams like Liquid who do a good job of using, I think maybe better than anyone else, of like using some of the newer heroes in captain's mode, like Jirax's Earth Spirit and Oracle, for example. So you did see that you didn't see the meta become kind of homogenized throughout the tournament, and that's refreshing as well. Like you don't kind of want to just see it everyone just blending into the same styles, and people just continuing to stick to their guns in terms of what they like to do.
Yeah, you're right. like the kind of trend of seeing a lot of Invoker, a lot of Chen, like not every team was kind of going towards that type of playstyle. And even Death Prophet sort of became like the very trendy hero to pick, I guess, in the group stages with a lot of these other qualifier teams competing in this tournament. But when you looked at like teams like Team Secret, even EG, I don't think I saw very much, if at all, Sumail Death Prophet or Arteezy Death Prophet, and Team Liquid in EG, like all these top tier teams, they really did bring their own unique approach. And yeah, like I really wanted to touch upon like just in terms of how there was like from patch to patch, like just bringing up Evil Geniuses for a good example, I suppose. I feel like the way PPD has drafted has stayed very constant in the sense that like his approach is always very, very like multifaceted, and it's like very it always employs like multiple concepts at once, um, in ways that other drafts just don't incorporate. And I just want to take for example like the EG LGD series because it was a 2-to-1 series and it was like very competitive. It always felt like PPD's drafts were trying to combine like ideas like for example vision, um, um, global presence, so like Prophet, Zeus, trying to get vision with treants, stuff like that. Even using Spectre, I think for 1 or 2 games throughout the playoffs, and it's just like PPD always tries to emphasize synergy with his own lineup, tries to counter the other lineup's strengths, and also tries to incorporate things like a global presence or like uh, you know advantageous vision, stuff like that. Whereas when you watch LGD draft and other teams draft, they sometimes just focus on 1 or 2 of those ideas, maybe just synergy for our own team or just trying to hard counter the other team. And that just really brings out like each of these drafters have their own style and whatever they want to emphasize in terms of like the philosophy of their drafts will always vary. And from patch to patch, it's gonna change what heroes are strong or whatnot. But the drafter styles still kind of shine through, and it was really cool to see that even after seeing such a huge change with this massive patch that we saw.
Yeah, they always seem to think about the game a bit differently. Like they
Hmm.
have not only the confidence, but like the kind of trust it seems in the players to take these other approaches. And we talked about mids and stuff to bring it back to that discussion. So you're starting to learn some of the kind of strengths and weaknesses from these heroes as well. Like Gyrocopter has kind of struggled a bit in this patch, and he remains a good hero who can be very active. But you're starting to see if you start to see battles where like teams are fighting kind of in like longer pitch team fights and more confined spaces, instead of it being a situation where like Gyro's a hero who excels at coming to fights without necessarily farm and ending them quickly. If you're seeing more drawn out and protracted fights, a Gyro who has to fight too early or who has to be front line against, say, like Chen creeps or a lone druid is not it's not the best situation for him. Like it's hard for him to stand up there and what is he going to do? Like spam rocket barrage in melee range? It's much tougher for him, say, without farm or without some time to build up. So you start to see that hero, he's still popular and his strengths are still there, but he's beginning to change. For Zeus, we've seen him a good amount, and obviously, he has like an insane amount of burst damage, and nukers and spellcasters in general got buffed. But I think you are starting to see this situation where Zeus doesn't have the same playmaking properties of some of these other heroes, like hero like Puck or Queen of Pain or even like Bat or something, can start fights and have a way of getting out or maneuvering within the fights. Zeus, however, has a bit of a different function. Like this is usually not a hero in terms of Zeus where you're just running at someone to like start a fight or a gank because he gets picked off so easily. He's not an especially mobile hero. So maybe that could contribute to some of his struggles as well. Maybe teams are starting to adapt to that, even though the hero otherwise benefited greatly from this patch. So all these like kind of little points to tinker with and adapt to, and like information for the teams to process and weigh. So that's again, that's like really, again, really exciting and nice to see that at least these heroes, it's not so deterministic of like this one is just crap or this one is just unplayable. Like they're trying to figure it out even in the midst of such a high stakes tournament.
Yeah, like these teams already have very quickly recognized like nuances and weaknesses with these really trendy heroes. And when you brought up like a hero like Zeus, I think that between like the EG LGD series, they actually alternated Zeus and TA picks, like I think 2 consecutive games. I think game 2 and game 3, or it was maybe game 1 and game 2, where the mid lane was just a Zeus TA lane. And I think very quickly they would kind of recognize that, Zeus just doesn't have that ability to uh, be a very competitive laner, right? Doesn't have much of a laning presence. He's gonna spam out his nuke. He's gonna get his creeps, but he can't stop the enemy mid from really farming as well. And so the TA was kind of left, unhinged, so to speak, and just kind of, you know, skyrocketed in farm because there's just nothing to really compete against in lane. There's not much that Zeus can do. And furthermore, Zeus and kind of Chen were also on these kind of opposing, exchanging exchanges in terms of like draft picks. Like for example, you see a first pick Chen, and then you see a first pick Zeus, because the idea being like you can nuke the Chen creeps with your static, and as well as your Q or whatnot. But of course, that leaves Zeus as a very prime gank target at the mid lane for the Chen, and so it's just like this back and forth, and different teams are trying to, they would take up the, maybe they'd take the Chen this game, and the enemy team would take the Zeus. But at the end of the day, it seemed like Alliance just understood all these nuances just better than everyone else. And I mean, it's just like these are all these heroes that Alliance has played for just countless games, and there's no like inside out. And it's kind of like playing. All these teams have been playing by different rules, right? But now it's finally time to play like by Alliance's rules, and it's like very punishing to play that way. That's how it felt.
Yeah, certainly. And again, you mentioned a hero like Zeus, maybe also valuable if you have these kind of like pitched battles in like a set location with mobility, like or fighting into kind of like a tight space. Well, Zeus is really good at that, and like obviously with whatever's on the front line, you have to worry about if you can't get at the Zeus, and he can just keep dishing out damage. But yeah, you mentioned that, and again, we always talk about like sample size of tournaments and how many games people play. And this is something that I'm certain that Nahaz will be able to. Looking forward to his wisdom and 2 cents on this as well when he comes on the show with us at some point. But it's like how we talked about this earlier too. It's like how do we evaluate like which team sets the meta, or is it a fluke, or is it just not enough games, not enough sample for them to adjust? And then how much of an advantage is that really for these teams that get to play more? And it seems pretty clearly there's a pretty clear trend that the teams that have been playing a lot do manage to get that edge, and that makes sense. But then, that starts to beg the question of with these tournaments coming up. You have the major coming up in about a month, and then you have MDL where we'll see OG basically playing a major tournament for the first time since the summit. Like, how are these teams going to adapt, and are they going to just make an even bigger splash in the pool and maybe say, knock Alliance off their pedestal a little bit? So we'll kind of see how that works. But yeah, like I really do wish that there's an issue of like saturation and talking about too many online tournaments and games and qualifiers, but maybe are we getting like less games than we should, and is
Yeah,
that
yeah.
like harming, like are we not seeing the premium teams play enough in between events, or is the game itself changing? Like Dendi has said some things on the current state of the game. So what do you make of that argument or that whole side of the equation?
Yeah, like I do kind of get that impression that there hasn't been that many just games between top teams to watch. It feels like there are a lot of tournaments, but you just don't seem to have it like a continuous flow of matches, like as much as there were, like say, like last year, when conversation of like tournament saturation really started to begin with. But now it just seems like, it kind of goes dark, and then you see these teams bring out what they got, and then it goes dark again, and it's maybe 2 days out of like, 2 or 3 days out of every 2 weeks where you can kind of watch EG or OG, but there's no guarantee that all these top teams are going to show up for the same tournament. And if teams like EG are going to wait for between like major and major to, kind of show their hand and their ideas on the drafts and on the patch, then it's going to be, Dota fans do kind of miss out. And it's also a little bit more of, it does cost them. Like when you're saying that Alliance was a very active team, that's completely correct. They played a crap load of games recently, and EG just simply hasn't. And I think PPD said it himself when he was, uh, doing one of his vlogs for the Star Ladder event. He was like, "Yeah, we're here to boot camp, and these are our actually first games on this patch in a, kind of a serious manner. And this was only a few days, maybe, a week before the actual LAN event. When you take in comparison Team Liquid and Alliance, who have like a massive volume of games in terms of qualifiers for, the major or whatnot. And so it's a really big difference for them.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously there's many different angles to this, and it's probably not fair for several reasons to the players if they constantly have to be playing in qualifiers and matches. But a part of me kind of does miss those days where you would see like a premium team play in like a quote unquote minor tournament like virtually all the time. Like it wouldn't even matter if the games were stops. Like it would still be nice to see them, and you could see them kind of maybe experiment with stuff or figure things out. Like
Yeah.
I would love to watch EG take on like a tier two team, say in North America more often, and say like Elite Wolves or something like that, and then just maybe deal with, hey, like is Mirana valuable to you because Elite Wolves play them well? Like I would love to see things like that a bit more often. Instead, it is nice that for the players that they get to kind of, as we mentioned, pick their spots a little bit more and maybe choose which premium tournaments to play. But I love to see those teams more, and also variance is kind of your enemy in that regard, just because you can lose, you can't get knocked out of a tournament fairly quickly. So we go months without seeing a squad, and as I said, OG they played a ton of events around Frankfurt time. I think right after they had like what DreamHack,
Hmm.
and then like the Summit, and yeah, they were just playing a ton of games, but then we haven't really seen them at all in like the last it's been basically 2 months. So
Yeah, you're right. Actually, I don't even remember like who's on that team even, right? Like we haven't seen OG in so long.
yeah, so I don't know. Like it feels like it might be kind of swinging the other way. Like obviously it's nice that teams aren't as desperate where they have to play in everything, and it's not fair for them to have to qualify. But I want to see more elite teams, and I don't know. It's a double-edged sword because obviously then the build-up for these events that of teams that you rarely see is much higher, but less Dota. And if it favors the teams that play more, then I don't know if that's just necessarily a good thing. Where you just want to see whoever's been at the most games in these patches are going to be doing well.
Yeah. And like you were saying, small sample size theater, we've only seen so few games out of EG and even like Team Secret on this new patch. They played relatively few games even this tournament, even though there was a decent group stage. Playoffs were, best of three, no best of five, grand finals. And they're kind of right back to the drawing board. And, like with like these with this like, it's just like kind of disappointing. Basically, we aren't given the opportunity to kind of follow their progression of like their ideas as well. Because talking back to like 2014 and stuff, we would have these routine games maybe every 2 days, every 3 days with these top teams. You can kind of see how these teams adapt their drafts and kind of pick up new heroes along the way. And instead, we're just kind of given a burst of activity once in a while, and it's just kind of it seems much more disjointed. That's just my impression of that.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, I mean, speaking of that, there are of course a couple big tournaments coming up. So, MDL is going to be in Shanghai next week, and regrettably, since I will be there, I will not be able to record the next episode of Wannabe Wednesdays. But so we'll see OG again on land. We'll see Evil Geniuses, Vici, Secret, a lot of premium teams. Basically, the Frankfurt field, like Maneski and LGD and eHome as
Oh
well,
yeah,
and
yeah.
then Complexity, who qualified I think a couple of weeks ago. I think they beat Elite Wolves actually in the finals of the qualifiers. They're going to be there representing North America, so we'll get to see them again in another land. And then actually, we talked about CDEC a little bit last week. We talked about how they have been kind of consistent, but I don't want to say disappointing, but they haven't been spectacular. They've beaten who they're supposed to. They actually have to qualify beginning tomorrow through the qualifiers for MDL. So Invictus Gaming and CDEC, some of the bigger names in the qualifier to make it to the event
Oh
of
wow.
actual MDL next week. So yeah, like again, there could be some volatility there. We've seen both of CDEC's youth teams perform very well. We've seen IG Vitality and Wings all make a splash. So who knows whether CDEC will actually be able to recapture some of their glory and actually even make it to this MDL event. So, but yeah, that's going to be a pretty big tournament coming up just next week, and we'll get to see a lot more.
And right after that week, we have Shanghai Majors. If I'm correct, Jack?
The Shanghai Major is going to be about a month after that, so
Oh, a
that'll
month
be
after. Okay.
yeah, that'll be the end of February, and then MDL is next week from like 27 to 31. So yeah, some good Dota coming out on the horizon, but and then we'll see the Chinese, how the Chinese scene shakeup works. I mean, like will there be a team that's this year's CDEC? There's a lot of promise down there, and again we talk about frequency of patch, and like these teams that are constantly playing in the qualifiers, like if they have the talent and they're getting to play a lot more than some other teams, as we saw like CDEC Young dispatching CDEC a couple events ago and running some very unconventional heroes, then who knows who could explode out onto this onto the next few months of this scene and really start to become this year's Cinderellas, just like Evil Geniuses emerged last year around this time. with DAC and all of that, and just like CDEC eventually started to merge too.
Yeah, for sure. Couldn't put it better myself. So after the Mars Dota 2 League, we're kind of getting towards like the Chinese New Year time of the year for the Eastern scene, and that's sort of like a reshuffle period in itself because the Western scene is kind of used to like the Christmas break being the logical end of the year, but obviously for China they kind of follow like the lunar calendar, and their contracts are sometimes structured around that instead, if I'm not mistaken, Jack. And so like, do you know if where that kind of where that will kind of that date will rest in terms of like, is it after the Shanghai Major or is it after Mars TV? Do you know?
So yeah, it is. It is basically usually structured around the Lunar New Year. But
Hmm.
I think the situation. Well, I think last year, um, so we didn't have the major. Obviously, it was just DAC, and I think it was earlier in the year than the major is going to be. So I think this time with the major system, regardless of the contract structuring, you're probably going to see the teams stay together. I would guess until at least after the major, just because I mean
Right.
at this point you can't even requalify, so you can't really make those kinds of changes now. You kind of just have to stick it through the major. So yeah, I think if all the stirrings of the pot we're not gonna see happen until basically March most likely.
I think it's gonna be really exciting though because we're gonna have something to look forward to in terms of like more roster shakeups potentially, of course. And if it's mostly in the East, then it's something that will like the time between like the Chinese roster shuffle and then a TI. I feel like the East really just starts to ramp up and the teams just they really settle down and stay static after that. We'll figure out if Xiao rejoins Dota again to like take LGD to the grand finals or whatnot. And yeah, I'm just really looking forward to that like kind of logical resting point and until the final sprint towards the finish.
Yeah, so I mean, word on the street is that he's definitely just biding his time, and he'll be back. He's just too valuable of a leader to not do that. But you brought up an interesting point. It made me think about kind of the reshuffle this year, and we did see a lot of like changes here and there, and maybe some big older names, more established names switching scenes. But I feel like there weren't that many like seismic changes throughout the course of that season. I mean, maybe it's because you had to submit your rosters for the Shanghai Major so early. I think it was like early December, so
Yeah.
there weren't really any huge like seismic shuffles. Like you had a lot of teams form and like say complexity or something, but and you had teams reform and bring back their older players, like Alliance obviously. But I it doesn't really seem like there've been that many seismic changes. Like maybe the major system really is starting to bring this kind of stability, and that was probably their goal in the first place.
Yeah. And at the same time, we still have like a few free agents kind of hanging around, and we're not really sure. But they're all like kind of really big names, like I mentioned, Xiao Wei. But also in the West, we still do kind of have Zai, who has talking about like playing because he did have to sit out this kind of year for his to finish out his high school degree, I think. But he did say that he did want to play the next year, and so I'm not sure if he's gonna maybe rejoin, and I don't know if that will trigger off another kind of cascade of roster movement. Who knows? Who knows? Maybe RTZ just leaves EG again, and then we have another really exciting roster period again. But we'll have to wait and see, right?
Yep. So the upside and downside of stability. So a good week of Dota, and then a lot to look forward to coming up. So you have any kind of thoughts, information, or things that really stood out to you from Star Ladder, or is there a totally new hierarchy now? Like everyone, basically, Alliance has won the last two major events, and they're essentially kind of a top dog at this point. But anything else you're really excited to see, maybe with the Mars TV League coming up, or in this next month leading up to the major?
Yeah, I mean, it is something good to kind of close out on in terms of like just kind of taking stock of like where do these teams really stand, right? Because Mars TV will be cool to watch because guess what? The big bully in the playground will be there. Alliance isn't going to be flying out to ruin everyone's day and rat their way to another tournament win. It'll be mostly, the doors wide open for OG, EG, Secret, and Vici and LGD to kind of sort themselves out. And of course, eHome. Like that's a super, super stacked field, right? No Team Liquid, but it's kind of unfortunate again that we don't have the full, complete fleet of teams, but I guess we can kind of see who can fight for second place, I guess, because I think a lot of rankings, I think Nahaz is included, which is kind of powered by Knoxville's like his own ELO based code, ranks Alliance extremely highly now after the conclusion of Star Ladder. And just in terms of like my eye test, I and of course the results from Alliance, you have to kind of put them top two, like probably number one, just because OG wasn't there. You don't know for certain, and after all, they did win the last major, and they haven't played any games for what it feels like, and so the door is kind of open. But you just kind of have to put Alliance at number one, and EG probably right behind them. LGD and eHome, we haven't seen them compete on land together, and Vici as well in quite some time now. And then you don't really know the stretch between OG and Secret and Liquid and where those kind of stand. But it's kind of like the Wild West, and everyone's kind of chasing after the Alliance. Horse just sprinting away.
Yeah, we haven't seen Vici and OG most notably in a while. I don't think either of them have really played anything big since the summit. I don't recall if Vici participated in the slew of other Chinese tournaments, but yeah, I mean LGD was at Star Ladder. We'll see Team Spirit there as well, and then finally, just one team has to run through the Chinese gauntlet to grab the final qualifier spot. So it's going to be a fun tournament, and then who knows if we'll be pressing the panic button, say if OG doesn't do well, even though it's such a small sample, or who knows, maybe a month from now we'll say, well, guess what? Alliance hasn't played any major tournaments since since Star Ladder because they don't have anything super huge going on this month, and then we start wondering about them, and maybe hey, has 6.86 passed them by now? Are they the ones who have to catch up? So it's all a big interesting rat race. That's why we love Dota so much, and they're looking forward to kind of just being there and soaking it all in, including the perhaps not so fresh air, and we'll have some interesting Dota coming up to say the least.
Yeah, take care of yourself, Jack. You should probably bring some gas mask or something, some purified oxygen.
Yeah, well, all right. So, well, I think that's going to do it for this latest episode of Wannabe Wednesdays. Any parting words you have, Shrew?
No, no, just excited to tune into the MDL this weekend and try to fill the void of Jack's absence for another week. We'll see what I can do in terms of maybe pulling in Nahaz as a guest or another appearance of Raiko, my good friend from Joan Dota.
Well, yeah, it'd be nice to hear him, and it's not much of a void. It's one that can be filled with just about anything.
Okay, okay, too humble, too modest.
So, as usual, some plugs. Defenseofthepatients.com is our website. That's defense with an S because we are Americans and not British. And of course, you can find Defense of the Patients on iTunes as well. And for Twitter, if you'd like to follow our whole .p network of shows, it's at DOTP_show. And that's for our whole and ever expanding network of shows. And my co-host is at Woodshrew Dota. I am at KBBQ Dota. And as usual, tomorrow's show is going to be Theorycraft Thursdays with Ursinity and Proud. And we're going to have some special exalted guests in the near future. I think we're going to have Pyrian, not on our show, but on, I think is it the Tuesday show?
I think
the main show. The main show. And we'll have Nahaz at some point as well, which just looking forward to speaking to the professor of Dota's metrics, I guess. So, sure. All right. So thank you guys for listening in. And as usual, we appreciate your feedback and criticism. We'll always try to do better each week, and have a good one. We'll see you on the other side of MDL, I guess, or with MDL underway next week.
Have a great week, guys.